The first sound was a lie, a gentle creak like the groan of an old house settling into the night. Amos shifted in his sleep, his dreams filled with the ghost of a half-forgotten lullaby. The second sound was the truth, a sharp, violent splintering of wood that tore through the midnight quiet and snapped him awake. His heart hammered against his ribs. That was not the wind. He was out of bed before his mind had fully caught up, pulling on his trousers with fumbling hands, his bare feet cold on the rough-hewn floorboards. He grabbed the rifle propped against the wall, its familiar weight a grim comfort. Through the cabin's single window, he saw nothing but an impenetrable darkness, the moon, a hidden cowardly eye behind a thick veil of cloud. But the sound had come from the corral. He moved to the door, his every muscle coiled. He eased it open a crack. The air that rushed in was cold and carried the scent of dust and nervous livestock. He could hear the low, agitated snorting of his few cattle, the frantic shuffling of their hooves. Then he saw them shadows on shadows, 3 figures on horseback, moving with a predatory slowness just beyond the fence line. Not rustlers. Rustlers were quick and quiet ghosts in the night. These men were loud, deliberate. They were making a statement. "Who's out there?" Amos's voice was a low growl, rough from disuse. He kept his body behind the solid oak of the doorframe, the rifle's long barrel resting in the gap. One of the figures urged his horse forward. The animal's breath plumed in the frigid air. The rider was a silhouette, but he sat his saddle with an unnerving stillness, an arrogant poise that did not belong to a common thief. "Amos Fletcher," the man's voice called out, and the sound of it sent a shiver down Amos's spine. It was not the uncultured drawl of a prairie drifter. The words were clipped, educated, laced with a chilling theatrical clarity. A man of property. A man of history. "State your business, or ride on," Amos commanded, his thumb stroking the rifle's hammer. A low chuckle drifted from the darkness. "My business, Mr. Fletcher, is with your history." Another rider dismounted, carrying a lit torch. The sudden flare of orange light threw the scene into stark, terrifying relief. The man with the torch moved not toward the cattle, but toward the barn. Amos's blood ran cold. The barn was more than wood and hay. It was a monument. He had raised every beam himself, Sarah at his side, handing him pegs, her laughter echoing in the vast, unfinished space. Her laughter was still trapped in the grain of the wood, in the scent of the cured timber. "Don't," Amos whispered the word, a prayer lost to the wind. "You see," the leader continued, his voice a silken thread of menace. "Some men build monuments of stone. You chose dust and splinters. A fitting choice, I suppose. But she deserved a palace, not this dusty tomb." The man with the torch reached the barn door and thrust the flame into a pile of dry hay stacked against the wall. The fire caught with a hungry roar, devouring the kindling in an instant. Flames licked up the dry timber, painting the night in flickering hues of orange and red. The heat washed over Amos, a physical blow. He raised the rifle, the leader's chest centered in his sights. But he couldn't shoot. In the swirling firelight, he saw the face of the third rider for the first time. The man held a pistol, and it was aimed not at Amos, but at the small window of the cabin, the window to Lily's room. A strangled cry caught in Amos's throat. He was trapped a pawn in a game he didn't understand. The leader watched the flames consume the barn, his expression one of rapt satisfaction. The structure that had taken a year of sweat and love to build was being reduced to ash in minutes. The roof groaned, sagged, and then collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a geyser of sparks spiraling into the black sky. "This is just the beginning," Fletcher, the leader, said, his voice cutting through the roar of the inferno. He looked directly at the cabin, his eyes glinting in the firelight, seeming to bore right through the walls and into Amos's soul. You'll pay for what you took from me, for what you took from her. He wheeled his horse around, and the three men melted back into the night, leaving Amos standing in the doorway, a helpless silhouette against the blazing funeral pyre of his past. The heat was scorching, but he felt a cold deeper than any winter. He stood there until the flames died down to a malevolent, glowing heart of embers, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle, the cryptic words echoing in his mind. She deserved a palace. You'll pay for what you took. He finally turned back into the cabin. The inner door to Lily's room was ajar. His daughter stood there, a tiny ghost-like figure in her white nightgown. She wasn't crying. Her face was a mask of placid shock, her large eyes fixed on the hellish orange glow outside, a reflection of the inferno dancing in their depths. She had not uttered a sound since her mother's death, and this new horror only seemed to drive the silence deeper, sealing it in place with a layer of fresh terror. He knelt before her, trying to find words of comfort that didn't exist. All he could do was pull her into his arms, his rough shirt scratching her cheek, the smell of smoke clinging to them both. He held her tight, as if his embrace alone could shield her from the world, a world that had just declared war on them for reasons he could not begin to fathom. The sun rose the next morning on a scene of devastation. A bruised, indifferent sky looked down upon the smoldering skeleton of the barn. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt wood and shattered memories. Amos stood amidst the ruins, his face caked in soot, his eyes burning from smoke and sleeplessness. He sifted through the blackened debris with a cold, methodical numbness, searching for anything salvageable. There was nothing. It was then that he saw the wagon approaching, a dark speck crawling across the vast expanse of the prairie, where the heat already shimmered above the cracked earth. It was Henderson, the trader from Redemption, a man whose presence Amos could barely tolerate. But he was not alone. A small figure sat beside him on the wagon bench. A woman. Henderson pulled the wagon to a halt a few yards from the cabin, his eyes widening as he took in the wreckage. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Looks like you had some trouble, Fletcher." Amos didn't reply. His gaze was fixed on the woman. She was slight, dressed in a worn silk tunic, its color faded to the shade of a twilight sky. Her hair was a slash of polished ebony pulled back from a face that seemed carved from porcelain and endurance. She kept her eyes downcast, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This is the one I told you about." Henderson grunted, gesturing to her with a dismissive thumb. "Last of the shipment. Her intended up and died. She says she's a hard worker, housekeeper. Figured with the girl and all." He trailed off, his mercenary gaze sweeping over Amos's desolate ranch. He clearly thought he was delivering a lamb to a slaughterhouse. Amos looked from the smoldering ruin of his past to this unexpected, unwelcome arrival. He didn't want anyone here. He had built a fortress of grief around himself, and Lily and its walls were meant to be impenetrable. But the events of the previous night had changed everything. He was no longer just a grieving hermit. He was a target. His home was a battlefield. He needed his eyes on the horizon, not on the hearth. Lily needed someone. He gave a single curt nod. Money exchanged hands, a few silver coins that felt like the price of a life. Henderson, eager to be away from the stench of destruction and the rancher's grim silence, clucked to his horses and left without a backward glance. The woman Mai slid down from the wagon seat. She stood before Amos, her small bundle of possessions clutched in one hand. The wind whipped a strand of black hair across her face, but she did not move to brush it away. In the harsh morning light, he could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but also a core of unyielding strength. "The well is back there," he said, his voice a rasp. He pointed with his chin toward the rear of the cabin. "Lily's inside. Don't touch her mother's things." The words were stones dropped into the silence between them. He turned and walked back toward the wreckage of the barn, his shoulders slumped under a weight far heavier than charred timber. He felt her gaze on his back, but he did not turn around. He had a war to prepare for. He had no time for anything else. Mai watched him go, a broad-shouldered man, intent on immersing himself in the ashes of his life. She looked at the cabin, a dark shape hunched against an unforgiving sky, and then at the endless empty prairie stretching in every direction. She had traded one form of desolation for another. Taking a deep breath of the smoke-tinged air, she picked up her bundle and walked toward the door. Tears were a luxury she had long since abandoned. She had work to do. The transformation of the cabin began not with a bang, but with a quiet war against grime and sorrow. Mai rose before the sun, a sliver of a woman moving through the pre-dawn gloom. The house was coated in the fine gray dust of apathy, a physical manifestation of the grief that had settled within its walls. She started with the windows. Using a rag and a bucket of precious water from the well, she scrubbed away the film of neglect until the pale morning light was no longer a muted suggestion, but a clear, sharp presence cutting across the wooden floorboards and illuminating the motes of dust her very movements stirred to life. Amos watched her from the corner of his eye as he sat at the table nursing a cup of bitter black coffee. He had grown accustomed to the dimness, had found a strange comfort in it. Her cleaning felt like an intrusion, a violation of the sacred stillness of his sorrow. He wanted to tell her to stop, to leave the dust where it lay, to let the house remain a tomb. But he said nothing. His disapproval was a palpable weight in the room. But she did not seem to notice. Or perhaps she simply chose to ignore it. She moved with an unhurried, relentless purpose. She found a half-empty sack of flour long forgotten in the pantry, and from it she coaxed life. Her hands, surprisingly strong, kneaded dough on the scrubbed clean table with a rhythmic push and pull, a silent meditation. Soon, the sterile, stale air of the cabin was filled with the warm, yeasty scent of baking bread, a fragrance so profoundly domestic, so tied to a life he had buried, that it felt like a physical blow. The smell clung to him, an unwelcome ghost of happier times of mornings, when Sarah would hum as she worked her flour-dusted hands shaping their daily bread. He retreated to the perimeter of his land, and the scent following him, a reminder of all he had lost and all he now had to protect. When he returned at midday, a loaf of golden-crusted bread sat on the table next to a bowl of thin stew she had made from dried beans and jerky. It was more than he had eaten in months. He ate without a word of thanks, his gaze fixed on the table, avoiding her eyes. But as he left, he saw her clearing the table, her movements economical and graceful. He noticed she had found a crack in one of the tin mugs and had carefully set it aside, a small, unspoken promise of repair. The house was slowly beginning to breathe again, and he did not know if the feeling it stirred in him was fear or a terrifying sliver of hope. That evening he sat cleaning his rifle, the scent of oil and steel a sharp counterpoint to the lingering aroma of bread. He watched her mend his torn shirt by the firelight, her needle dipping and rising with a practiced precision that was mesmerizing. The silence between them was vast, a canyon of unspoken histories. But for the first time, it felt less like an absence and more like a space waiting to be filled. A week after the fire, a rider appeared on the horizon. Not a shadowy night raider, but a lone man on a lathered horse riding hard under the unforgiving midday sun. Amos met him on the porch, rifle in hand. The rider, a nervous young man from Redemption, kept his distance, holding out a sealed envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "For you, Mr. Fletcher." He stammered, his eyes darting toward the burned-out shell of the barn. "A man in town paid me to deliver it." He dropped the envelope on the porch steps, wheeled his horse, and galloped away without another word. Amos picked it up. The paper was thick, expensive. His name was written on the front in elegant flowing script. He tore it open. The letter inside was not a letter at all, but a formal legal-looking document. It was a land offer signed with a flourish by one Silas Kane. It offered a pittance for the ranch, a fraction of its true worth. But it was the final sentence that made the blood freeze in his veins. Bikaker, you have 1 month to accept this generous offer, after which the property will be considered forfeit and will be cleared by whatever means necessary. It was a declaration of intent, cold and absolute. Silas Kane. The name meant nothing to him, yet it was the name of the man who had destroyed his barn, threatened his daughter, and now intended to strip him of his land. The educated voice from the darkness now had a name. The fight was no longer a shadowy threat. It was a ticking clock. 1 month. The word echoed in the vast silence of the prairie. The next day, Amos rode for redemption. He left Mai with a spare rifle and strict instructions: shoot anything that comes over that rise that isn't me. He saw a flicker of understanding and something that looked like resolve in her dark eyes before he turned the horse and spurred it into a gallop. Redemption was a dusty artery of a town, its lifeblood the fickle flow of commerce and gossip. Amos tied his horse outside the sheriff's office, a squat building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own futility. Sheriff Brody was a man gone, to seat his face a roadmap of busted veins, his belly straining the buttons of his sweat-stained shirt. He was polishing a tarnished silver star as Amos entered. Fletcher Brody said, not bothering to look up, "Don't see you much." Amos laid the letter from Silas Kane on the desk. "I want to report an attack. Arson. A threat on my life." Brody picked up the letter, his lips moving as he slowly read the words. He placed it back on the desk with a sigh that smelled of stale whiskey. "Silas Kane, you say, wealthy man. Just bought up the old Miller claim east of here. Paying top dollar for folks to work for him. Seems to have influence. His men burned my barn. They threatened my daughter," Amos said, his voice dangerously low. "You see their faces?" Brody asked, finally meeting Amos's gaze. His own eyes were weary, evasive. "It was dark. I saw one. But this letter is proof of his intent." "A letter ain't a confession, Amos. It's a business offer. Aggressive, maybe, but not illegal. Kane's got a fancy lawyer in town already. Without a witness, my hands are tied." He picked up his star and began polishing again, the conversation clearly over. Amos stared at him, a cold fury building in his chest. Brody wasn't just dismissive. He was scared. Intimidated. Silas Kane had arrived and bought not just land, but the law itself. Amos was utterly, completely alone. He snatched the letter from the desk and stormed out, the sheriff's feigned indifference following him like a bad smell. He walked to the general store, his mind racing. He needed supplies, cartridges, flour salt. As he pushed through the door, he nearly collided with a man coming out. The man was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored Eastern suit that was absurdly out of place in the dusty town. His face was handsome, but marred by a cruel twist to his lips. He paused, looking Amos up and down with an air of amused contempt. "Pardon me?" The man said, his voice the same educated, chilling tone from the night of the fire. "You must be one of the locals." Amos's hand instinctively went to the Colt at his hip. This was him. This was Silas Kane. He felt a primal urge to draw to end this, here and now. But the street was full of people, and Lily was waiting at home. As Kane stepped past him, Amos's eyes caught a detail. The man wore fine leather gloves. The left glove was fastened at the wrist with a small distinctive silver button shaped like a hawk's head. The image seared itself into Amos's brain. After the fire, as he'd sifted through the ashes near the corral, he'd found something in the dirt. Something small and metal that must have been dropped in the chaos. He'd pocketed it without thinking. Now he knew what it was. A small silver button shaped like a hawk's head. He watched Cain walk down the street, a predator, moving confidently through a herd of sheep, and knew this was a fight he couldn't win with brute force alone. This man was clever protected and hiding a motive that went deeper than land. Back at the ranch, while Amos wrestled with his new terrifying knowledge, Mai was conducting her own assessment. She walked the perimeter of the cabin, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She saw how the back window, the one in Lily's room, had a loose shutter that rattled in the wind. She saw how the woodpile was stacked too close to the house, providing easy cover for an attacker. She was not a warrior, but she understood the geometry of survival. Using Amos's tools, she secured the shutter with fresh nails, her hammer blows echoing in the quiet afternoon. She began the arduous task of moving the woodpile, stacking it piece by piece against the far wall of the corral. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity, her small frame belying a formidable strength. When Amos returned dust-covered and grim-faced, he found her reinforcing the front door with a heavy iron bar she had salvaged from the barn's wreckage. She hadn't waited for instructions. She had seen a weakness, and she had fortified it. He stood for a moment, watching her. In a world where the law had abandoned him, this quiet, determined woman was preparing for a siege. He had brought her here to be a housekeeper, but he was beginning to realize he had found an ally. The weeks that followed were a cold war fought under the vast, indifferent prairie sky. Silas Cain did not attack again directly. His pressure was insidious, a slow tightening of a noose. One morning, Amos found the water from the well tasting bitter and strange. He discovered a dead rabbit tossed into its depths, its body fouling their only source of fresh water. It took him 2 days of back-breaking work to drain clean and refill the well, 2 days of rationing their precious reserves. Another time, a section of his fence was cut during the night, scattering his few remaining cattle across the open range. It took him the better part of a week to round them up. Each act of sabotage was designed to wear him down, to exhaust his body and his spirit. Amos, in turn, began his own investigation. He rode to neighboring ranches, describing Silas, asking questions. He learned little. Cain was a mystery, a wealthy stranger who kept to himself, his affairs handled by lawyers and paid men. But in town, whispers followed him. Henderson, the store owner, full of cheap talk and cheaper whiskey, mentioned that Cain had been asking questions of his own about the Fletchers. Not about Amos, but about his late wife, Sarah. About the accident. While Amos fought the external battle, Mai fought the internal one. She continued her patient, gentle siege on the fortress of Lily's silence. The child was a miniature echo of her father's grief, moving through the cabin like a wisp of smoke, her eyes large and haunted. Mai understood that trust, like a wild bird, could not be captured, only coaxed. She would leave a small piece of warm bread, glistening with a touch of preserved honey, on the edge of the hearth where the girl often sat. For days the offering was untouched. Then one morning it was gone. It was the first sign, a tiny crack in the frozen landscape of the child's heart. One afternoon, Mai was mending one of Lily's dresses, a faded calico garment worn thin with use. The thread she used was her own, a spool of deep blue silk she had carried with her from her homeland, a vibrant, impossible color in this world of brown and gray. Lily, who had been watching from her usual safe distance, crept closer, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She reached out a hesitant finger and touched the shimmering thread. Mai paused, her needle held aloft. She did not look at the child, but instead she took Lily's small hand and guided her fingers, showing her how to make a single perfect stitch. The girl's touch was as light as a moth's wing. They sat like that for a long moment, bound by the single strand of blue silk, a silent communion of shared creation. The next day, Lily came inside, clutching something in her fist. She walked directly to Mai, who was peeling potatoes by the fire, and opened her hand. Inside lay a single prairie wildflower, a defiant splash of purple against her grimy palm. Mai stopped her work carefully, wiped her hands on her apron, and accepted the gift with a solemnity befitting a crown jewel. She found an old, empty tin cup, filled it with water, and placed the flower inside, setting it on the rough-hewn windowsill. It was a small, fragile thing, yet it held the room a single point of life in the suffocating monochrome of their existence. Amos saw it when he came in for supper, covered in dust from a day spent rounding up his scattered herd. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the purple bloom against the glass. He looked from the flower to his daughter, who was sitting closer to Mai than he had ever seen her sit before, and then to Mai herself. His world was being systematically dismantled by an unknown enemy, his past twisted into a weapon against him. Yet within the walls of this besieged cabin, this quiet woman was with nothing but a piece of thread and a cup of water, beginning to stitch his broken world back together. His investigation into Silas Kane continued to yield nothing but whispers and dead ends. Frustration gnawed at him. The 1-month deadline was a shadow that grew longer with each passing day. He needed answers. Desperate, he rode back to redemption, determined to force a confrontation. He found Silas Kane leaving the saloon, looking as immaculate as ever. Amos dismounted and stood in his path. The townsfolk on the street stopped, sensing the tension that crackled in the air like lightning. Kane, Amos said, his voice flat and hard. Silas turned, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across his face. Mr. Fletcher, to what do I owe the pleasure have you come to accept my generous offer? I've come to find out why you're doing this, Amos said, ignoring the bait. Why me? Why this land? Silas's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. This isn't about land, Fletcher. Not really. It's about justice. It's about a debt that has gone unpaid for far too long. I don't owe you anything, Amos growled. Not me directly, no, Silas said, taking a step closer. He lowered his voice, but it carried an intensity that made the hairs on Amos's neck stand up. You owe it to my sister. Amos stared at him, confused. I don't know your sister. The smile vanished from Silas's face, replaced by a mask of pure, distilled hatred. Oh, I think you do. You knew her very well. You married her. You took her away from her family, from a life of comfort, and brought her to this God-forsaken wasteland. And then you killed her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The noise of the street faded to a dull roar in Amos's ears. He could only stare at the man before him, his mind struggling to process the impossible words. Sarah was your sister, he whispered. Sarah was my baby sister, Silas, hissed the venom in his voice, palpable. And you, with your rough hands and your empty promises, you let her die in the dirt. A broken wagon, an accident. I never believed it. You were negligent. You murdered her as surely as if you'd put a gun to her head. This land, this life you built with her, it's all forfeit. It belongs to me now. I've come to claim my inheritance and to exact my revenge. The revelation struck Amos with the force of a physical blow. The mysterious vendetta was suddenly horribly personal. This wasn't a land grabber. This was family. This was a man twisted by his own grief, his own version of the past. The fire, the threats, the silver button, it all snapped into place. Amos felt a wave of dizziness, the sun-baked street seeming to heave beneath his feet. The enemy was no longer a faceless shadow. He had Sarah's eyes. The revelation shattered him. Amos rode back to the ranch in a daze, Silas's words echoing in his head. You killed her. For years he had carried the guilt of the accident, a private, soul-crushing burden. But to hear it voiced as an accusation, as a motive for a vengeful war, gave it a monstrous new life. The grief he had so carefully contained threatened to consume him whole. He retreated into himself, the fortress walls going up higher and stronger than ever before. He stopped mending the fences, stopped patrolling the property. He just sat staring at the empty space on the mantelpiece, where Sarah's picture used to be, the rifle lying idle across his lap. He was paralyzed, his resolve faltering under the weight of this new, complicated grief. He saw the truth in Silas's accusation, the kernel of guilt that had been festering in his heart all along. Maybe Silas was right. Maybe he deserved to lose everything. Mai watched him, her expression unreadable. She continued her quiet work, ensuring there was food on the table, that the fire never went out. But she saw the light fade from his eyes, the fight drain out of him. She saw him surrendering. One evening, as he sat in his usual stupor, she approached him. She placed a steaming mug of broth on the small table beside his chair. He didn't acknowledge her. You have a daughter, she said, her voice soft but firm. Her English was still hesitant, marked by the cadence of her homeland, but the words were clear as a bell. He flinched as if struck. She watches you. Mai continued, her gaze unwavering. She sees you give up. This man, Silas. He burns your barn. He tries to take your home. But he only wins if you let him. If you let him burn your heart too. Amos slowly lifted his head, his eyes hollow. You don't understand. He's her brother. I understand he tries to hurt a child. She replied, her voice sharpening with a fierce protective edge. I understand he tries to make Lily an orphan. Sarah is gone, but Lily is here. You fight for her, for the future, not for the ghosts of the past. Her words were a bucket of cold water, shocking him out of his self-pitying fog. He looked past her and saw Lily in the doorway, watching them, her small face a mirror of his own despair. Mai was right. His surrender was not just his own. He was surrendering his daughter's future to a man consumed by a warped and hateful grief. In that moment, something shifted inside him. His bond with Mai, forged in necessity and silent understanding, solidified into something stronger. He was not alone in this fight. He looked at Mai, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a housekeeper or even an ally, but as a partner. The keeper of his home, the protector of his child, and the guardian of his own failing resolve. The sky had been a bruised purple for days, the air heavy and still with a sense of impending violence. Then the storm came. It descended upon the plains like a furious white beast, a late-season blizzard that was both unexpected and terrifyingly savage. The wind screamed, and the world vanished, erased by a swirling vortex of snow. The universe shrank to the four walls of their small shelter, trapping them in an enforced intimacy. On the second night of the storm, as Amos was securing a rattling shutter, a sudden gust of wind tore it from his grasp. It slammed back against the cabin wall, and a piece of splintered wood flew through the air, catching him on the temple. He staggered back, a searing pain exploding in his head, before crumpling to the floor unconscious. When he awoke, the world was a blurry, throbbing haze. Mai was leaning over him, her face etched with concern. She had dragged him to his cot and was pressing a cool, damp cloth to the gash on his head. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the roles had been irrevocably reversed. He, the master of the house, the protector, was now completely dependent on her. The injury and the relentless cold brought on a fever. He drifted in and out of consciousness, trapped in a nightmarish landscape of disjointed memories. He was back at the wagon, the sky spinning, Sarah's hand slipping from his. But this time the memory was different, sharper, more honest. He remembered the argument they'd had just before, the terrible words spoken in anger. The fever stripped away the idealized memories, leaving only the raw, painful truth. He began to talk, the words spilling out of him. He spoke of his regret, of his pride, of the crushing weight of being the one who survived. Mai sat with him, a steadfast presence in his turmoil. She listened to the confession of his broken heart, and in the shared darkness she tended not just to his body, but to the shattered fragments of his soul. When the fever finally broke, the storm had passed, and a profound understanding had settled over him. This cabin was no longer a tomb. It was a home, and he would defend it to his last breath. The deadline came and went. The silence from Silas Kane was more unnerving than any open threat. Then one night the storm returned, but this time it was not snow, but a ferocious thunderstorm. Rain lashed against the cabin, and thunder cracked like the sky itself was splitting apart. Through the roar of the storm, Amos heard it, the splintering of the corral fence. They were back. "Get Lily," he said to Mai, his voice grim. "Stay away from the windows." He grabbed his rifle, his movements sure and steady. He was no longer a man adrift in grief, but a man with everything to lose and everything to fight for. Shadows on horseback materialized out of the deluge, their forms illuminated by brilliant flashes of lightning. This time, there were 5 of them. They weren't here to burn a barn. They were here to finish it. The assault began. Gunshots exploded, wood splintered as bullets tore through the cabin walls. Amos fired back, using the precious seconds between lightning flashes to find his targets. Inside, Mai huddled with Lily in the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, the trapdoor covered by a heavy rug. She held the girl tight, whispering stories from her homeland to drown out the sounds of the battle above. One of Silas's men managed to get to the front door, trying to kick it in. But the iron bar Mai had installed held firm. Amos shot him through the door, the heavy caliber rifle round punching through the oak with a deafening roar. Then a new sound, the scrape of something heavy against the back wall of the cabin. Silas. He was trying to pry the shutter off Lily's window, the one Mai had tried to secure. "I'm coming for what's mine," Fletcher's Silas screamed over the howl of the wind. Amos knew he couldn't defend both the front and the back. He was trapped. Then he heard a sound from the cellar. The trapdoor creaked open. Mai emerged, her face pale but resolute. In her hands, she held the spare rifle. She didn't know how to shoot, but she had watched him. She moved to the back window, her hands trembling, but her purpose clear. The shutter finally gave way, with a screech of tortured metal. Silas's face appeared in the window, illuminated by a flash of lightning. His features a mask of triumphant rage. "It's over, Fletcher. She was leaving you. Did you know that? The day she died, she had finally had enough of this wretched life. We argued. That's why you crashed. You killed her because you couldn't stand to lose her." The words hit Amos harder than any bullet. The secondary twist, the final poisoned barb, the argument he'd tried to forget. It was because she wanted to leave. His idealized memory of their marriage shattered completely. He was fighting for a lie. He faltered, his rifle lowering for a fraction of a second. In that instant, Silas raised his pistol. But he never fired. A deafening blast exploded from beside Amos. Mai had fired the rifle. She missed Silas, the bullet splintering the window frame inches from his head. But the shock of it, the sheer impossibility of the quiet housekeeper taking up arms, made him recoil. The distraction was all Amos needed. His grief, his guilt, his rage, it all coalesced into a single clarifying purpose. He wasn't fighting for the past anymore. He was fighting for the woman and child who were here now. He fired. The shot was true. Silas cried out and disappeared from the window. The tide had turned. The remaining men, their leader down, lost their nerve. They fired a few more wild shots before melting back into the storm-racked night. The silence that descended was more profound than the thunder. It was the silence of survival. In the immediate aftermath, the storm broke. The rain gentled to a soft drizzle, and the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised gray and hopeful rose. The cabin was a wreck, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and rain. Amos, Mai, and Lily stood together amidst the wreckage, wounded and exhausted, but unbroken. As the sun cleared the horizon, two riders appeared. It was Sheriff Brody and a young deputy. The deputy, it turned out, had heard the gunshots from his homestead a few miles away, and ashamed of his boss's inaction, had forced Brody to ride out. They found Silas Kane near the back of the cabin, his leg shattered by Amos's bullet, his fine suit soaked in mud and blood. As the deputy put him in irons, Silas's hateful eyes met Amos's. "She deserved a palace," he rasped, his voice choked with pain and defeat. "She deserved to make her own choices," Amos replied, the words coming from a place of newfound peace. "You never let her." The sheriff took Silas and his captured men into custody, his blustering apologies falling on deaf ears. Amos, Mai, and Lily were left alone to survey the damage. The fight was over. The long, difficult task of rebuilding was about to begin. Weeks later, the ranch was slowly healing. The bullet holes in the cabin walls were plugged, the shattered window replaced. With the help of a few neighbors who, hearing of his stand against Kane, had finally offered their support, a new barn was beginning to take shape, its frame a skeleton of promise against the blue sky. The rhythm of their lives settled into a new pattern, one of peace and quiet labor. One afternoon, while clearing out the last of Sarah's things from an old trunk, Amos found it. A letter tucked into the lining that he had never seen before. It was in Sarah's hand, dated the day before she died. With trembling fingers, he read it. Silas had been right. She had been distraught. She was going to leave, but not to leave him. She had just learned from the doctor in Redemption that the complications from Lily's birth had left her unable to have more children. She was devastated, convinced she was a failure as a wife, that she was robbing him of the large family he'd always dreamed of. Her plan had been to go to her brother just for a while to give them both space, because she couldn't bear to see the disappointment in his eyes. "I love you more than this land, more than the sky," she had written. "But I feel like I am a broken thing. I don't know how to tell you." The letter did not absolve him of the accident of his reckless driving born from their argument. But it absolved him of the deeper guilt that the one Silas had planted in his heart. It was not a lack of love that had broken them, but a depth of sorrow she felt she couldn't share. He could finally let her go, not as a flawed memory to be fought over, but as the woman he had loved in all her beautiful human complexity. That evening, he walked with Mai to the frame of the new barn. The setting sun bathed the prairie in a soft, golden light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the simple, unadorned silver ring he had bought in town, what felt like a lifetime ago. He had given it to her as a declaration, a shield against the world's judgment. Now he offered it as a promise. He took her hand, her small, capable fingers lacing with his. "Mai," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "The first house I built here was a monument to the past. I want to build this one for the future, with you." He slid the cool silver band onto her finger. It was not a question, but this time it was a proposal. She looked from the ring to his face, and in her dark, knowing eyes, he saw his answer. A slow smile spread across her lips, a radiant dawn after a long night. Lily, sensing the moment, ran to them, placing her small hands over their joined ones, her touch a benediction. The three of them stood there before the rising frame of their future, a new and unlikely constellation. A broken man, a resilient woman, and a child who was beginning to find her voice again. Their separate sorrows braided together to form a bond of quiet, unshakable strength. Outside, the sun finally slipped below the horizon, and the vast prairie darkened into night. But inside the small circle of their family, the future glowed with a warm, steady light, a beacon of earned peace, a defiant and hopeful star in the immense silent dark.